History loves to brag about elegance, but honestly, most stylish people were one wardrobe choice away from accidental self-destruction. Because nothing says sophistication like clothing that actively threatens your survival. And trust me, it only gets more unhinged from here. 1. Nothing captures humanity's commitment to bad decisions quite like the medieval rule demanding women wear floor-length trailing gowns so enormous they functioned less like clothing and more like mobile tripwires, which meant every noble gathering had at least one rich guest face. Planting into a wall because the era's fashion icons apparently believed elegance required a 30-foot fabric tail sweeping up dirt, dropped food, small pets, and the occasional unlucky servant. Tailors bragged about these monstrosities as if they were engineering achievements rather than wearable safety hazards. And the women stuck with them moved through castles like slow-motion parade floats hoping not to catch fire from nearby torches, because nothing says high status like knowing a stiff breeze or an inattentive doorway could yank you into the afterlife. The real miracle of medieval fashion isn't that it looked beautiful, but that anyone managed to survive it long enough to pass the trend on. 2. Fashion took an even more aggressive stance on mortality when noblemen embraced the codpiece era, proudly strapping armored fabric boxes to their hips like Renaissance traffic cones announcing, "Here comes bad judgment," with some versions reinforced so heavily they could stop small projectiles yet offered zero stability, meaning men strutted around with the structural balance of a poorly installed mailbox. The truly ambitious ones stuffed their codpieces with fabric, fruit, or whatever nearby object suggested virility, accidentally creating portable battering rams that routinely knocked over chairs, startled horses, and once reportedly sent a wedding guest tumbling into a fountain. Wearing one was less about status and more about demonstrating a willingness to risk spinal misalignment for fashion, because nothing commands respect like a decorative metal triangle threatening to snap your pelvis if you try to sit too quickly. The codpiece was basically history's reminder that confidence and common sense rarely coexist. 3. The Georgians decided shoes should injure the wearer at every possible moment, which is how we got heeled slippers so tiny and unstable that aristocrats glided around ballrooms like malfunctioning shopping carts, wobbling dangerously on footwear designed by someone who clearly hated feet, physics, or both. These shoes forced people to balance on surfaces smaller than a shot glass, guaranteeing sprained ankles, shattered dignity, and the occasional airborne aristocrat when someone attempted a dance move requiring lateral motion. Witnesses described parties where half the guests spent the night clinging to furniture like rock climbers in silk, while hosts pretended nothing unusual was happening because acknowledging the hazard would imply the rule itself was stupid. But the era insisted beauty required suffering, and apparently also required footwear capable of buckling under the emotional weight of a compliment. In the end, the shoes never improved anyone's posture, but they provided ample entertainment for anyone watching nobles desperately try not to collapse. 4. No fashion rule demonstrates historical self-sabotage quite like the Victorian obsession with monstrously wide crinolines, which transformed women into human satellites with skirts spanning entire dining tables, forcing them to navigate narrow hallways by rotating sideways like confused barn doors while pretending this was completely normal social behavior. These skirts trapped heat, restricted movement, and caught on furniture with the enthusiasm of a clingy ex. Yet society insisted they were the height of elegance. The real danger came from the hoops, giant steel cages capable of flipping upward in strong winds, exposing the wearer like a startled umbrella, or collapsing entirely if someone sat down too quickly, turning a fashion statement into a personal steel entrapment device. Even worse, the skirts frequently brushed against fireplaces, creating instant fire hazards because someone decided flamethrower, but make it ladylike, belonged in the dress code. Surviving a crinoline wasn't style, it was accidental heroism. 5. As if wide skirts weren't hazardous enough, the same era decided to weaponize hair by stacking it into towering architectural sculptures, held together with pins, wax, and enough flammable product to qualify as a municipal risk, leaving women wandering around with heads that doubled as unstable monuments to societal expectations. These coiffures grew so tall that sitting required either impeccable posture or total surrender, and entering a carriage meant bending sideways like a contortionist performing under protest. The higher the hairstyle, the more likely it was to collect dust, insects, or small decorative birds someone mistook for accessories. and any open flame nearby turned the entire fashion trend into a spontaneous fireworks display waiting for ignition. People admired these towering hairdos with the same reverence one gives to jet engines, impressed, but aware they could go catastrophically wrong at any moment. Fashion here wasn't an art form, it was a non-renewable resource of bad ideas. 6. Because comfort was apparently illegal throughout history, the Elizabethans introduced ruffs, gigantic starched neck donuts that forced wearers to hold their heads perfectly still unless they wanted to snap their own collars, which created the delightful illusion of people gliding around in slow motion, as if auditioning for a period drama about medically induced stiffness. These ruffs restricted eating, drinking, and turning one's head more than 5 degrees, leaving many wearers performing awkward torso rotations to glance sideways like malfunctioning animatronics. The real danger wasn't the discomfort, but the starching process, which involved heating flammable chemicals directly under the fabric, meaning one rogue candle could transform a dinner guest into a cautionary tale. Yet society adored these walking halos of inconvenience, insisting they conveyed refinement, while everyone secretly knew they functioned more like fancy cervical braces. Fashion demanded discipline, and apparently also limited blood flow to the brain. 7. The elite of ancient China took beauty standards to their logical and horrifying extreme with foot binding, a practice that deliberately reshaped feet into tiny, deformity-ridden crescents considered the height of desirability, turning everyday walking into a high-stakes gamble between balance, pain tolerance, and gravity's daily vendetta. The bound feet were trapped in rigid shoes, so small they'd make modern doll manufacturers concerned, forcing women to shuffle like they were permanently avoiding a spill on the floor. Navigating stairs required concentration normally reserved for bomb technicians, and falling was practically a scheduled event. Yet the social rule insisted these dangerously altered feet symbolized grace, even though they removed every remaining trace of mobility. This wasn't fashion. It was a multi-generation group project dedicated to disabling half the population for aesthetics. The remarkable part isn't that the practice existed, but that people managed to function at all while their shoes actively attempted to fold them into the pavement. 8. Men in the French court embraced a different flavor of self-endangerment by wearing towering heeled shoes dyed bright red, status symbols that shouted, "I outrank you," while also whispering, "I may fall at any moment," turning every palace hallway into a catwalk of impending ankle catastrophes. These heels were so narrow and so tall that walking resembled a trust exercise between aristocracy and the floor, and any misstep could send a nobleman tumbling like a poorly balanced statue. The rules required men to wear these heels even on slick marble surfaces, which transformed routine greetings into cautious ballet routines no one practiced for. Tripping wasn't just common, it was inevitable, and each fall echoed through the palace like a reminder that ego and physics are rarely compatible. The shoes said power, the posture said panic, and the laws of balance said, prepare for a hardwood introduction. 9. The highly decorated mantua sleeves of the late 17th century were so enormous they turned simple tasks like eating into spectator sports, with aristocrats attempting to maneuver gigantic bell sleeves past candles, plates, and human beings as if performing an unsolicited magic act. These sleeves flared outward like fabric megaphones, catching anything within a 1-foot radius, making dinners a competitive sport where the goal was, don't accidentally knock a bowl of soup into diplomacy-ending territory. The garments also acted as portable storage units, unintentionally collecting crumbs, cutlery, and small pets, which meant one dramatic gesture could send an entire dining table into chaos. Fashion insisted, the wider the sleeve, the grander the status, ignoring the minor issue that wearing them near fire, crowded rooms, or gravity created a risk level previously reserved for battlefield maneuvers. The mantua proved once again that elegance and practicality rarely bother speaking to each other. 10. The ancient Romans, ever innovators in questionable life choices, adopted extremely long decorative togas as formal wear, garments requiring such elaborate wrapping that a single misplaced fold could drag half the fabric across the ground like a ceremonial mop. Senators often tripped while delivering speeches because their togas had wrapped around their ankles like clingy toddlers, creating the sort of unintentional slapstick that would have been funnier if the garments didn't double as tripping hazards on marble floors. The rules demanded the toga remain pristine, yet it caught dirt, spilled wine, and unsuspecting pets with unstoppable enthusiasm. Worst of all, the excess fabric served as a surprisingly effective fire scoop when brushed too close to oil lamps, meaning a casual walk through a banquet hall could escalate into a personal conflagration. The toga wasn't just clothing, it was a booby trap approved by the Senate. 11. The 18th century introduced panniers, side cages strapped to the hips that turned dresses into aircraft wing-level hazards, so wide women had to enter rooms sideways like elegant forklifts, which would have been comedic if the mandatory etiquette didn't insist they pretend everything was normal. Doorways became negotiation points, carriages became claustrophobic math puzzles, and any attempt to sit risked the entire structure folding like disappointed origami. The panniers weren't just inconvenient, they redefined personal space by eliminating it entirely, transforming social life into a continuous exercise in collision avoidance. And because flammable candles were everywhere, these oversized skirts doubled as accidental wick extensions just waiting to ignite. Yet society praised the silhouette as the pinnacle of sophistication, ignoring the minor detail that navigating a room required as much spatial awareness as piloting a small aircraft. Fashion didn't just inconvenience wearers, it openly dared them to survive. 12. Renaissance nobles adopted slashed sleeves, garments intentionally cut open to let contrasting fabric puff outward like decorative internal organs, because subtlety was clearly banned. And maintaining this look required such stiff, restrictive stitching that simply raising an arm turned into a calculated risk. The sleeves could catch on furniture, door handles, or wandering animals, and one snag was enough to yank a person sideways with all the grace of a falling bookshelf. Worse, the puffed fabric often concealed sharp fastening pins, so reaching into one's own clothing could result in bloodshed, although fashion insisted this was a small price for looking like a festive pastry. These outfits made movement unpredictable and occasionally catastrophic. But the trend endured because nobles valued theatricality over functional limb usage. Nothing highlights a culture's priorities like clothing that risks turning the wearer into a slow-moving hazard zone. 13. Medieval sumptuary laws demanded pointed shoes, so pointed they sometimes stretched 2 feet beyond the wearer's actual toes, forcing men to secure the elongated tips to their knees with laces so they wouldn't trip over their own fashion choices, which created the delightful effect of nobles walking like confused marionettes dragged by an indecisive puppeteer. The longer the tip, the higher the status, leading to people strutting around in shoes that doubled as personal spears, threatening anyone within range. Stairs became the natural enemy of footwear, and uneven ground was just an elaborate slapstick invitation. Yet men proudly embraced these absurd contraptions, convinced they were symbols of elegance rather than imminent orthopedic disaster. Footwear shouldn't require a binding system, but this era's fashion philosophy seemed to prioritize humiliation over mobility. 14. Ancient Japanese court nobles wore kosoed sleeves so long they swept the ground like ceremonial floor cleaners, dragging debris, ink, and unlucky insects behind them while forcing their owners to move with exaggerated caution to avoid stepping on their own clothing and face-planting into a poem they were supposed to be reciting. The sleeves became so massive that everyday tasks like writing, eating, or gesturing required an entourage of attendants to physically rearrange the fabric before catastrophe struck. Candlelit ceremonies turned into high-risk events where one wandering sleeve could ignite half the aristocracy, and the rules demanded stoicism even as garments actively attempted arson. Yet society praised these oversized sleeves as embodiments of refinement, ignoring the fact they turned every hallway into a slip-and-fall waiting list. Fashion didn't just demand grace, it demanded survival instincts. 15. The 19th century fashion world decided hats weren't complete unless they were weighted down with real birds, sometimes entire taxidermied specimens, because apparently headwear needed both questionable ethics and poor aerodynamics. These hats grew so heavy they caused chronic neck strain, migraines, and the occasional fainting spell when someone attempted to stand too quickly under the weight of an entire woodland ecosystem. Walking outdoors in windy weather became a gamble between dignity and gravity, and sudden gusts frequently sent hats flying like macabre feathered frisbees while their owners lunged after them with the desperation of someone watching their bank account roll across the street. Some hats even included protruding wings or beaks sharp enough to injure bystanders during crowded events, turning social gatherings into low-stakes jousting tournaments. Fashion insisted these hats were the pinnacle of sophistication, but anyone standing nearby knew they were closer to airborne liability. 16. Court life reached new levels of impractical genius when European aristocrats embraced ribboned masks and elaborate veils so thick they essentially functioned as wearable privacy screens, forcing their owners to navigate gardens, staircases, and social interactions like bats deprived of echolocation. These veils were meant to project mystery and modesty, but mostly projected confusion, as fully grown adults drifted around like haunted lampshades, desperately hoping they weren't about to collide with a decorative hedge or an ambassador. The rules demanded the veil stay on at all times outdoors, even during windy weather, which meant aristocrats often staggered sideways across courtyards with all the stability of a ship that failed its sea trials. Lifting the veil for vision was considered vulgar, so they improvised by developing a slow, tentative shuffle that suggested they were searching for the meaning of life rather than the nearest doorway. Fashion provided the disguise, gravity provided the consequences. 17. Nothing showcases historical commitment to discomfort quite like the 18th century corset rules, which insisted women compress their rib cages so aggressively that fainting became less a medical emergency and more a built-in design feature, turning ballrooms into polite obstacle courses of collapsing elegance. Corsets were tightened by servants who apparently took competitive pride in achieving structural rigidity, rivaling small architectural projects, leaving their unfortunate wearer to drift through parties in a state of shallow-breath determination, while pretending the experience was charming rather than an ongoing negotiation with consciousness. Doctors warned about organ displacement, but fashion dictated that a visible waistline mattered more than internal organs staying in their assigned seats. The real spectacle came during dancing, when each spin risked transforming lightheadedness into a full-body shutdown, forcing other guests to dodge gracefully falling silhouettes like they were navigating a Regency-era domino chain. Beauty standards weren't just demanding, they were actively hostile. 18. Medieval helmet fashion delivered its own special flavor of hazard when nobles insisted on wearing ornate face-covering visors during festivals and feasts, not for battle but for dignity, which apparently meant voluntarily limiting oxygen flow and peripheral vision while attempting to eat roasted meat in public. These helmets weighed enough to realign posture and made dining a surreal experience where guests attempted to slip tiny morsels through narrow slits like frustrated children feeding snacks into vending machines. Visibility was so poor that nobles often greeted the wrong people, toasted empty space, or confidently walked into pillars while pretending they meant to do that. Removing the helmet inside was forbidden by etiquette, which meant every meal looked like a banquet for knights who had lost a bet. The best part was that the helmets muffled speech so thoroughly, conversations sounded like distant echo chambers full of confused metal cans trying to discuss politics. Fashion has never been so acoustically challenged. 19. Victorian mourning fashion solidified its reputation as a slow-moving safety hazard by requiring widows to wear heavy, dragging black crepe that absorbed moisture like a cursed sponge, turning rainy days into endurance trials, where every step added an extra pound of despair to an already depressing outfit. The rules mandated months or even years of these suffocating garments, which meant women moved through cities like sorrow-themed parade floats, swaddled in fabric engineered to cling to door hinges, carriage wheels, and passing strangers with clingy enthusiasm. The dye used in the crepe often caused skin irritation, fainting, or coughing fits, but etiquette insisted visible suffering was part of proper decorum. The most dangerous feature was the veil, a thick, opaque sheet that blocked visibility so effectively, widows frequently walked into furniture or traffic, but were expected to maintain composure afterward. Nothing says respect for the deceased, quite like risking additional casualties in their honor. 20. Ancient Egyptian elite took eye makeup to its most hazardous extreme by lining their eyelids with thick coal containing lead. Yes, actual lead. Because glowing under temple light apparently mattered more than avoiding the long-term consequences of smearing toxic minerals directly beside the brain. Wearing it required frequent reapplication, meaning servants approached nobles' eyes with the steadiness of bomb technicians while trying not to poke anyone into an early meeting with Osiris. The makeup dripped in heat, smeared during ceremonies, and occasionally ran into the eyes, creating a burning sensation that nobles interpreted as divine intensity instead of the obvious chemical reaction. Still, society adored the look, praising anyone who could maintain a perfect smoky eyeliner while ignoring the minor symptom of systemic poisoning. Fashion demanded commitment, and nothing says commitment like sacrificing neurological function for a sharper winged liner. 21. The Renaissance introduced extravagant shoulder armor for ceremonial outfits, massive decorative pauldrons shaped like animals, wings, or overly enthusiastic metal mushrooms that served no defensive purpose but excelled at snagging tapestries, knocking over goblets, and destabilizing wearers with the aerodynamic efficiency of attached boulders. Nobles strutted around in these monstrous accessories while pretending their balance wasn't in constant negotiation with physics, and every greeting required careful choreography to avoid accidentally headbutting someone with a steel eagle. The larger the pauldron, the greater the prestige, which meant gatherings looked like competitive cosplay events, where everyone silently prayed they wouldn't tilt too far left and topple dramatically into a suit of armor. These pieces weighed so much that removing them required assistance from multiple attendants, turning fashion into a team sport no one asked for. Elegance in this case meant carrying a metal sculpture on each shoulder and pretending it wasn't ruining your spine. 22. Georgian powdered wigs were already fire risks, but adding flammable perfumes and decorative feathers practically guaranteed spontaneous combustion, especially in candlelit ballrooms where guests leaned in to gossip with the precision of people who knew one miscalculated whisper could turn their hair into a festive torch. The rules insisted on constant repowdering, coating wigs in fine particles that hung in the air like a flammable fog, just waiting for a stray spark to redefine someone's evening plans. Wigs grew taller and heavier each year, dominating personal space and occasionally smacking chandeliers or knocking small items off shelves when their wearers attempted dramatic head movements. Maintaining one required a full team armed with combs, mixers, and the patience of saints. Yet nobles insisted these cotton candy death traps were essential markers of refinement. Nothing conveys sophistication like needing fireproofing to attend a polite conversation. 23. The Edwardian era delivered one of history's finest examples of fashion versus mobility, when women adopted enormous Merry Widow hats, wide-brimmed catastrophes supported by internal wire cages that turned every doorway into a geometry exam and every horse ride into a hazard assessment. The hats caught wind like ambitious kites, pulling wearers sideways with unexpected force and occasionally launching themselves off heads with the enthusiasm of migrating birds. The rules forbade removing the hat in public settings, meaning women at the theater watched performances through a structural overhang comparable to a porch roof. Worse, the metal frames jabbed shoulders, scraped cheeks, and sometimes snapped under their own weight, turning the hat into a collapsing steel trap with decorative ribbons. Society praised the drama of it all, but anyone standing within 2 feet knew these hats were less fashion statements and more wearable wind turbines with boundary issues. 24. In medieval Japan, aristocrats followed a beauty rule requiring teeth to be dyed black in a process called ohaguro, which involved applying an iron and vinegar mixture so noxious it stained not only teeth but also lips, cups, clothing, and occasionally innocent bystanders standing too close during application. The dye smelled like a potion brewed by someone who misunderstood every step of chemistry, yet nobles insisted the effect was elegant and symbolized maturity. The process had to be repeated constantly, turning personal grooming into a never-ending ritual of self-inflicted dental vandalism. Worst of all, the mixture dripped easily, leaving black trails down the chin that etiquette required wearers to ignore, as though walking around with Gothic ink smears was a perfectly respectable choice. Fashion here wasn't painful so much as relentlessly messy, the kind of trend that proved people will do almost anything if society agrees to call it beautiful. 25. Early modern Europe took accessorizing to dramatic extremes with chokers made from metal, lace, or velvet, so tightly fastened around the neck that wearers moved with the cautious precision of guests at a haunted house dinner party, terrified of making any sudden motion that might remind them their jewelry was one good twitch away from interrupting oxygen flow. These chokers symbolized refinement, while simultaneously compressing the throat enough to make breathing optional. And societal rules demanded they remain on even during long events where fainting was already a popular pastime. Dancing required a delicate balance between elegance and not passing out mid-waltz, and hosts pretended not to notice as guests leaned casually against walls attempting to regain circulation. The best part was that the tighter the choker, the higher the status, which just proves that throughout history, fashion and basic biological needs were rarely invited to the same conversation. 26. The Byzantine obsession with jeweled sandals led to footwear so overloaded with gems, metal studs, and embroidered designs that simply walking across a polished floor became a test of courage, ankle stability, and how much disposable wealth someone was willing to sacrifice to the gods of poor traction. These sandals clinked, jingled, and occasionally shed loose ornaments that skittered across floors like decorative caltrops waiting to sabotage unsuspecting guests. Wearers moved with exaggerated deliberation, partly to maintain dignity and partly to avoid performing an unplanned interpretive dance routine involving accidental splits. Maintaining the sandals required constant repair because fashion insisted on maximum decoration even if it meant every step risked spraining something important. Nothing says imperial prestige quite like footwear that challenges your ability to remain vertical. 27. The Tudor court embraced sleeves so absurdly long and heavy they dragged behind wearers like reluctant pets, sweeping up dirt, spilled wine, loose coins, and occasionally small items other people swore had gone missing. These sleeves weren't allowed to be shortened because they signified status, even though their primary functional purpose seemed to be entangling themselves in door handles and tripping their owners during ceremonial walks. Lifting them required both hands, leaving wearers defenseless against accidental collisions or rogue breezes capable of flipping the fabric into nearby candles. Yet nobles adored these elongated hazards because they created an illusion of grandeur, while also creating a strong possibility of colliding with a suit of armor or knocking over a diplomatic document table. Fashion demanded extravagance. Practicality demanded a resignation letter. 28. Medieval European hoods often featured liripipes, long trailing fabric tails so unnecessarily extended they dragged behind wearers like runway lights guiding them directly into misfortune. These appended fabric ropes got tangled around furniture, wrapped around ankles, or looped themselves into knots that turned quick movements into accidental slapstick routines. Young nobles treated them as decorative symbols of status, blissfully ignoring that a length of cloth doubling as a leash for gravity wasn't exactly a wise life choice. The liripipes whipped dramatically in the wind, smacking bystanders and occasionally knocking items off shelves with the enthusiasm of a mischievous ghost. Removing them was considered unfashionable, so owners simply adapted by developing a careful, sweeping turn radius rivaling that of a small boat. Fashion history proves that if something looks impressive enough, people will wear it even if it actively tries to strangle them. 29. Ancient Mesopotamian elites adopted towering cone hats designed to make them look powerful, but the effect was more akin to unstable traffic cones balanced precariously on skulls, swaying with every step like they were broadcasting the weather in real time. These hats sat on the head with minimal fastening, meaning any sudden gesture, gust of wind, or overly enthusiastic greeting could send them toppling like ceremonial dominoes. The taller the cone, the more important the wearer. An excellent system except for the part where height increased instability, forcing officials to walk as if transporting fragile glassware atop their heads. Removing the hat indoors was considered disrespectful, so they kept them on while bowing, sitting, and squeezing through doorways clearly not designed for wearable architecture. The hats symbolized authority, but to everyone watching they symbolized a powerful person one misstep away from a very public tumble. And that's our grand tour of fashion trying to wipe people out. Drop your pick for the dumbest disaster in the comments. And if you survived this episode, go ahead and subscribe.